The question hit Jennifer Walsh like a knife through her chest. Standing at the Family Feud podium in her carefully chosen lavender blouse, the one that hid how thin she'd become from years of grief and treatments, she felt every one of her 29 years pressing down on her like stones, 7 times. 7 times she'd felt life grow inside her only to slip away before she could hold it. 7 times she'd planned nurseries that would never hear laughter. "What breaks your heart?" Steve Harvey had asked, and those 4 words opened a chasm of loss so deep that Jennifer wondered if she might disappear into it entirely. It was Wednesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Walsh family had driven 5 hours from Charleston, South Carolina, in Jennifer's Honda CR-V, the same car she'd driven to 7 different emergency rooms, 7 different ultrasound appointments where heartbeats stopped, 7 different procedures to remove the babies she'd already loved completely. The back seat still had the infant car seat they'd installed after the first positive pregnancy test 3 years ago. She couldn't bring herself to remove it. Jennifer Walsh looked like someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. Her blonde hair was shorter now than it used to be, easier to manage during the months when getting out of bed felt impossible. Her blue eyes held the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, the bone-deep weariness that comes from hoping and losing and hoping again until hope itself becomes a form of torture. The Walsh family was small, but determined to support Jennifer through what everyone called her journey. Her sister Michelle, 32, had been the one to suggest applying for Family Feud. "You need something to look forward to," she'd said during one of their kitchen conversations about fertility treatments and adoption possibilities, and whether Jennifer should keep trying or accept that motherhood might not be meant for her. Michelle's husband David was gentle and understanding, having watched his sister-in-law disappear a little more with each loss. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had innocently asked why Aunt Jennifer was always sad, not understanding that sometimes adults carry grief too heavy for children to comprehend. What the audience didn't know was that Jennifer's house was a museum of almost motherhood. 3 different nurseries in 3 different bedrooms, each one decorated and ready for babies who never came home. The first one was yellow and green, gender neutral, painted when she was 12 weeks along, and thought she was safe. The second was pink for the daughter she'd lost at 16 weeks. The third was blue for the son who'd lived inside her for 18 weeks before his heart stopped beating for reasons no doctor could explain. During family introductions, Steve had been immediately drawn to something fragile in Jennifer's demeanor. There was a careful quality to the way she spoke, like someone handling glass that might shatter at any moment. "Jennifer," Steve had said during the opening segment, "tell me about yourself. What do you do for work?" "I'm a pediatric nurse," Jennifer had replied, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew her story. "I take care of babies in the NICU. Premature babies, sick babies. I help them grow strong enough to go home with their families." Steve had noticed something in her voice when she talked about babies, a quality that went beyond professional dedication. "That must be rewarding work. Do you have children of your own?" Jennifer's smile had faltered for just a moment, like a mask slipping before being quickly repositioned. "Not yet," she'd said, and those 2 words carried the weight of 3 years of trying, 7 pregnancies, 7 losses, and the growing fear that not yet might become never. The game had progressed through 4 rounds with the Walsh family holding steady against the Rodriguez family from Texas, but Jennifer's participation felt effortful, like someone performing the role of a game show contestant, while her mind was somewhere else entirely, probably in one of those empty nurseries at home, where cribs sat unused and stuffed animals waited for children who would never claim them. Jennifer had named them all: Baby Walsh 1, Baby Walsh 2, all the way through Baby Walsh 7. She'd written their names in a journal she kept hidden in her bedroom drawer, along with ultrasound pictures and the tiny hospital bracelets she'd worn during each pregnancy. The journal was her way of proving they'd existed, even if only for a few weeks at a time. Now, in the final round with everything on the line, Steve was asking the question that would force Jennifer to confront the endless cycle of hope and loss that had defined her adult life. "Jennifer," Steve said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him America's favorite host. "We need 41 points to win this thing. What breaks your heart?" The studio buzzed with familiar energy. The Walsh family needed this answer to secure victory and take home $20,000 that could help with the fertility treatments that weren't covered by insurance. The experimental procedures, the consultations with specialists, the adoption fees, if they decided to try a different path to parenthood. This should have been manageable territory. Most people would say saying goodbye to loved ones. Watching children grow up too fast, seeing people suffer, universal experiences of heartbreak that everyone could relate to without revealing anything too personal. But Jennifer stood frozen at that podium, her mind racing through 3 years of decorating nurseries for babies who would never use them. 3 bedrooms full of tiny clothes that had never been worn, toys that had never been played with, books that had never been read. All of it waiting, always waiting, for children who existed only in her heart and in those brief, beautiful weeks when she'd carried them inside her body. "Jennifer?" Steve prompted gently, stepping closer to the podium. He could see something shifting in her expression, could sense that his question had touched something much deeper than he'd intended. Jennifer looked across the stage at her family lined up at their podium. Michelle was watching with the careful attention of a sister who'd held her through 7 different losses, who'd helped her take down nurseries and pack away baby clothes, and pretend that each loss didn't break her a little more. David stood with his steady presence, the brother-in-law who'd learned that sometimes love meant not saying anything at all. Emma was trying to understand why the adults seemed so serious. This 8-year-old who didn't know she was the only child in the family who would ever call Jennifer aunt instead of mom. "Empty nursery rooms," Jennifer said, and her voice cracked on the word empty, as if speaking it aloud made the absence of children feel even more absolute. The studio fell completely silent. This wasn't the polite quiet that comes during game show suspense. This was the profound hush that emerges when 300 strangers suddenly understand they're witnessing something sacred and heartbreaking, something that touches the deepest fears and longings of anyone who has ever wanted to be a parent. Steve's expression changed immediately, his game show host demeanor dissolving to reveal something more human, more vulnerable. In 40 years of hosting, he'd heard thousands of answers to thousands of questions, but something about the way Jennifer said empty nursery rooms, with such devastating precision, such quiet devastation, cut through every professional barrier he'd built around his emotions. "Tell me about those rooms," Steve said, abandoning his position and walking closer to Jennifer. The game could wait. The points could wait. This moment was about something infinitely more important than any prize they could offer. Jennifer reached into the small purse she'd brought, the same one she'd carried to 7 different hospitals. 7 different appointments where hope died a little more each time. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone, scrolling to a folder of pictures she'd never shown anyone outside her immediate family. "I have 3 nurseries in my house," she said, her voice growing steadier as she settled into the rhythm of a story she'd never told publicly, but had lived privately every single day for 3 years. 3 different rooms for 3 different babies who never came home. 7 babies total. But the first 4 losses were early enough that I hadn't started decorating yet. The audience was completely still, hanging on every word of a nightmare that millions of women live through but rarely talk about openly. "The first room is yellow and green," Jennifer continued, her voice beginning to break. "I painted it when I was 12 weeks pregnant with my first baby. We thought we were safe. Everyone says once you hear the heartbeat, you're safe. But we weren't safe. Nobody's ever really safe." Steve found himself fighting back tears, completely absorbed in this glimpse into a pain he'd never fully understood. "The second room is pink," Jennifer said, tears now flowing freely. "For my daughter, I felt her move inside me for weeks. I sang to her, read to her, planned her whole life. I bought tiny pink dresses and hair bows, and a mobile with butterflies. She died at 16 weeks. The doctors said sometimes these things just happen." The cameras were capturing not just Jennifer's words, but the transformation happening on her face as she spoke. The way grief was making room for love. the way loss was revealing the depth of her capacity for motherhood. "The third room is blue," Jennifer continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. "For my son. He lived inside me for 18 weeks. Long enough to have a name, Michael, after my grandfather. Long enough to see his face on the ultrasound, to know he had his father's nose. Long enough to buy him a baseball glove and dream about teaching him to throw. But not long enough to hold him. Never long enough to hold any of them." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that would define not just this moment, but his understanding of what it meant to truly serve the people who trusted him with their stories. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, met countless families, and prided himself on his ability to find hope in difficult situations. But standing there looking at a woman who had loved 7 children she'd never been able to hold, he found himself in territory where easy answers felt like insults and platitudes seemed cruel. "Jennifer," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion and something that sounded like wonder, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Those babies were real. Your love for them was real. The rooms you prepared for them. That wasn't foolish or premature. That was love. That was hope. That was you being the mother you already are." Jennifer looked up at him with eyes that held 3 years of wondering if her grief was valid. If mourning children who never took a breath made her foolish. If the empty rooms in her house made her pathetic rather than loving. "But they're empty," Jennifer whispered. "I decorated rooms for children who don't exist. I bought clothes for babies who will never wear them. I planned lives for people who never got to live." "Those rooms aren't empty," Steve said firmly, kneeling down so they were eye level, abandoning every protocol about maintaining professional distance. "Those rooms are full of love. They're full of hope. They're full of the kind of mother love that exists before birth and continues after loss. You are not empty, Jennifer. You are full of love that just hasn't found its permanent home yet." The studio was electric with the kind of emotion that comes from witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't a game show anymore. This was one human being helping another carry a grief that threatened to define her entire existence. "You know what I think?" Steve continued, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. "I think those 7 babies chose you to be their mother for whatever time they had. I think they felt that love, even if it was only for a few weeks. I think you gave them something beautiful in the time they existed, and they gave you something beautiful too, the knowledge that you have the biggest, most generous heart of any mother I've ever met." Without consulting producers, without following any script, Steve did something that no game show host had ever done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the one he used for jotting down thoughts and observations between tapings. "I want you to do something for me," Steve said, tearing out a clean page and handing it to Jennifer along with a pen. "I want you to write down their names, all 7 of them, because they had a mother who loved them, and that makes them real, that makes them worthy of being remembered." The cameras caught the moment when Jennifer's face transformed from grief to something approaching peace. With shaking hands, she wrote 7 names on the paper, Baby Walsh 1 through Baby Walsh 7, along with the 3 who had lived long enough to earn real names, Emma Rose, Michael James, and David Thomas. "Now," Steve said when she finished writing, "I want you to keep this paper, not hidden in a drawer with your other private grief, but somewhere you can see it every day, because you are not a woman who failed at motherhood. You are a woman who loved 7 children with a love so pure and complete that it existed without condition, without guarantee, without anything in return except the privilege of loving them." The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical game show celebration. This was recognition of courage, of a woman who had chosen to love again and again despite devastating losses. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that what had just happened would change how people thought about loss, love, and the nature of motherhood itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "Jennifer just taught us something profound about what it means to be a mother. Motherhood isn't about successfully carrying babies to term. Motherhood is about love. And love doesn't end just because a pregnancy ends. Jennifer has been a mother 7 times. 7 times she chose hope over fear, love over self-protection. That's not failure, that's heroism. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something extraordinary continued to unfold. Women approached Jennifer not with pity, but with their own stories of pregnancy loss, of infertility, of the empty rooms and unused baby clothes that marked their own journeys through the landscape of almost motherhood. The common thread in every story was the question Jennifer had been asking herself: am I allowed to grieve for children who never lived outside my body? But perhaps the most meaningful moment came from a woman in her 60s who approached Jennifer with tears in her eyes. "I lost 3 babies 40 years ago," the woman said quietly. "Back then, nobody talked about it. We were told to just move on. Try again, forget it ever happened. Watching you tonight, seeing you honor their memory, that's the first time I've ever felt like someone understood that they were real, that they mattered, that I was allowed to love them." Jennifer hugged this stranger tightly, understanding that grief had created an instant bond between women separated by decades, but united by the specific pain of loving children they'd never been able to hold. 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with extensive resources for pregnancy loss support and fertility counseling. The response was unlike anything in game show history. Thousands of women reached out to share their own stories of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infertility, many saying it was the first time they'd felt permission to publicly acknowledge their losses. Jennifer's moment sparked a national conversation about pregnancy loss, about the validity of grief for children who died before birth, about the importance of acknowledging that love begins long before delivery and continues long after loss. Steve's foundation partnered with pregnancy loss support organizations and fertility counseling groups across the country to create programs specifically designed to help women and families navigate the complex emotions that come with losing pregnancy and struggling with infertility. But the most important change happened in Jennifer's own life. She started attending support groups for women who'd experienced pregnancy loss. She learned that her grief was not only valid, but necessary, that mourning her babies was not pathetic but powerful. She discovered that the empty nurseries in her house weren't shrines to failure, but monuments to love. Jennifer eventually became a volunteer counselor for other women experiencing pregnancy loss, helping them understand that the love they felt for their unborn children was real, that their grief was valid, that their motherhood began the moment they first felt protective of the life growing inside them. She still has those 3 nurseries in her house, but they're different now. Not empty waiting rooms for children who will never come, but spaces that honor the 7 babies who lived briefly but were loved completely. The yellow and green room has become a reading nook, where she sits with the books she'd planned to read to baby Walsh 1. The pink room displays the tiny dresses and butterfly mobile in a shadow box that celebrates the daughter who lived for 16 weeks in her heart. The blue room has Michael's ultrasound pictures, and the baseball glove that still waits for small hands that will never hold it. The question that broke Jennifer's heart, "What breaks your heart?" became the question that helped her understand that broken hearts can still love, that empty arms can still mother, that loss doesn't negate love but often reveals its true depth. The miscarriage mother's empty arms weren't really empty at all. They were full of love that had nowhere to go except into helping other women understand that their losses were real, their grief was valid, and their love was the most real thing of all. Because motherhood isn't defined by successful pregnancies or live births. Motherhood is defined by love. And Jennifer Walsh had loved 7 times, completely and without reservation, which made her not a failed mother, but a mother who had loved more purely than most people ever would. And in the end, that love, brief but boundless, was what made those empty rooms full.